In this video, we will discuss memory. We will begin by defining what memory is. What are the various types of memory? How do humans memorize? We'll also be concerned with examining some of the factors that might be responsible for facilitating better memory or actually inhibiting memory. So let's proceed. So before we begin defining memory, I think most of you are aware of the idea of what memory is. Basically just things, remembering things from our past experience. Things like photographs here that can actually trigger our memories. Maybe some other examples might be listening to songs or something, and that will actually take us back to a time in life when we were experiencing something. Here's another example of how our memory can be triggered. So definitely, a lot of people remember where they were when they first heard about 9/11 terrorist attack. And so that right there is an example of what's known as a flashbulb memory. It's basically, something that happened, an unusual event that occurred in someone's life and usually has strong emotional associations. All right, so let's arrive at a little more in-depth definition of what memory is. So memory is a group of related mental processes that are involved in acquiring, storing, and retrieving information. So we will further examine those three terms: acquiring, storing, and retrieving. So basically those three fundamental processes are actually referred to as encoding. And if you look down below here in red, I said encoding involves the input of information into the memory system. So when basically our brain is first receiving incoming data, information, that is actually, the brain is actually encoding it. And then if the information progresses to the next step in the process, that is what's known as storage. And that's basically retaining, storing the information into different parts of the brain. And then later, as an individual tries to remember something, recall something, that is actually known as retrieval, getting the information out of the memory and bringing it back into one's awareness. So those are the three fundamental processes involved in memory. Okay, so there are basically three types of memory that are well known, and the first of those is called sensory memory. So basically that is just memory that's registering a great deal of information from the environment for a very brief period. So if you just think about, where you're sitting at right now as you are listening to me explain this, actually your brain is actually taking a lot of sensory memory in about your entire environment, what you are seeing, what you were feeling, what you were hearing, what you were smelling, all kinds of things. And so that sensory memory is the first stage in memory. And then short-term memory, that's basically what is referred to as working memory also. And basically that refers to the process of holding all the information that you were thinking about or you're consciously aware of. So right now, as I'm telling you about this, you are holding this in your short-term memory and you're processing this and saying, okay, is that the information about which I should be focused on that's important or something. So short-term memory is also known as working memory. Now, the thing is, once an individual actually holds information or data in short-term memory for 20 to 30 seconds, it has potential to move into what is called long-term memory. So that just means storage of information that can last in one's memory for potentially a lifetime. So let's just take a look at those three types of memory a little more in depth, okay? So first of all, the types of sensory memory. So visual sensory memory is also called iconic memory. And that's basically, memory of what one perceives through one's eyes, visual information. And that actually lasts approximately up to a half of a second. So it's very short-lived. And the reason for that is because there is so much visual data sensation in one's environment that we just can't hold on to it for a long period of time unless we focus on one thing and hold it in our working memory, our short-term memory. Okay, now auditory sensory memory, that is referred to as echoic memory. And that basically means the type of memory that one is listening to, hearing. That is auditory sensory memory. And that usually lasts a little bit longer. That lasts up to 3 or 4 seconds. Then we're going to move on to the second stage of this, of memory processes, and this was short-term, or what is also known as working memory. And working memory usually lasts about 20 seconds. And that is when basically in the process of when you were taking in new data or information into your awareness and then thinking about it and holding it in your mind and processing it for about 20 or so seconds, 20 to 30 seconds, that is short-term memory or working memory. Okay, so 20 seconds doesn't seem like it's very long, but if one holds one's attention on it for that entire period, there's a potentiality that it will be transferred into long-term memory. Now, you might be thinking, well, my attention, lasts longer than 20 seconds, that kind of thing, and that is true. But there are certain ways to actually keep information in one's short-term memory for a longer period of time. So when one does not want to forget something, like take for instance, if somebody tells you their phone number very quickly, and but you don't want to forget, but you don't have a way to write it down or put it in your phone immediately, you might actually tell yourself that phone number repeatedly over and over in your mind. Well, that repetition right there, holding it in your mind and actually practicing it over and over, that's what's known as maintenance rehearsal. So remember, that's mental or verbal repetition of information. Okay, and then one other way to work on memorizing information when one is engaging their working memory here. There are other techniques, so different researchers have said, well, when it comes to memorizing, say, a group of digits or numbers and stuff, this researcher, George Miller, said, well, the magical number that one can actually remember is usually right around 7 and plus or minus 2. So if you think about it, when one phone numbers are usually 7 digits, not including like maybe an area code or something. But when you add the area code to those 7 digits, then maybe it'll be plus or minus or +3 actually. So just kind of keep that in mind here. And then another way of putting together information to where it can maybe hopefully help you to remember it is what's called chunking. Or, so I'll explain that in just a second. Chunking just means putting together similar information into chunks. And then that way you're not trying to memorize all kinds of sporadic, random data. You're actually putting it together into some kind of system. And so let's move on. So when it comes to long-term memory, you remember that's like basically information that's stored longer than the 20-second duration of short-term memory or working memory. Okay, so remember when it comes to long-term memory, that can be unlimited in quantity, and it can also be unlimited in length of time that it can be stored. So it can be stored throughout one's entire lifetime. So taking this examination into long-term memory just a little bit further here, there's a couple different, a few different types of memory when it comes to long-term memory. So there's what's known as procedural memory. And that basically means, remembering, like different types of physical skills, operations, actions. And so I did add, that it's also sometimes known as muscle memory. So whenever you think of muscle memory, stuff that is automatic, that you've just done so many times physically, that you don't even have to think about it, that's what's known as procedural memory. Now, the second type of memory is what's referred to as episodic memory. And basically that means remembering specific events or episodes, including the time and place. So when one remembers something that occurred at one point in their lifetime, and says, well, yeah, I'll never forget, it was kind of a cold day, and when this occurred, and it surprised me, and I was 17 years old, that kind of thing. Well, that's actually episodic memory. And so also, I put a note right here related to episodic memories, what's known as autobiographical memory. And that just means remembering details about one's life. Past events in one's life. What is one's personal story, how they progress throughout life, things like that. That's autobiographical. Now, the third type of memory down here is what's known as semantic memory. And that means basically memory of knowledge, facts, names, definitions, concepts. So definitely when you are seeking to memorize the information that I am exploring in this video, well, that is actually semantic memory. And then there are two systems of long-term memory here. Okay, so the first of these is what's known as explicit memory, and that is memory with awareness. So basically, that's like episodic and semantic type information. So information or knowledge that can be consciously recollected. Now, the second system of long-term memory is what's known as implicit memory. That is memory without awareness. So basically that is, all like muscle memory, motor skills, actions, things like that. So I did put this chart in here just to kind of help you just kind of see this for those of you who like to see a visual um, representation to help you think you might that might actually aid in your memorization of this material. So please pause the video and look at this chart. And you can see though that I've got this arranged so that we're talking on the very top, we're talking about long-term memory. And then that is divided into the two types right here. There's explicit and implicit. And then there are two different forms of that explicit right here, which are episodic and semantic. And then implicit knowledge here on the right-hand side, implicit type of knowledge, here are the procedural and emotional conditioning that are under that category. So I hope that helps you. Let's proceed here. So you remember earlier on in our discussion, I used the term clustering, putting items together to form categories. Okay, so definitely like lists, when one is trying to memorize a whole bunch of items, like from a list or something, it's actually easier to memorize if you put them into groups or categories instead of being random. So, definitely the more random information is, the harder it is to memorize it. So here's an example of clustering. So if one were to look at this list and say, try to memorize it, you might say, well, that's a lot of things to memorize here. But then if you actually start looking at it and said, okay, well, how many categories are in this list here? And then how can I put some of these items into their appropriate categories? Like take, for instance, chair. Well, that's a type of furniture. So if you kind of look down the list, you can start putting all the furniture together, like a chair, and then look down below, footstool, bed, et cetera, et cetera. And then start memorizing all the items according to each category. And that is clustering. Okay. And then you remember I mentioned that maintenance rehearsal is one technique, repeatedly saying something over and over in your mind and or verbally aloud in order to help you not forget it. Now, it's been found, though, that definitely maintenance rehearsal, when it comes to putting information eventually into your long-term memory, that is, maybe not quite as effective as what's known as elaborative rehearsal. Okay, that's been found to be a little more effective. Now, remember, maintenance rehearsal means basically repetitious practice over and over, saying something over and over to oneself in order to eventually memorize it. So it's not totally ineffective, but elaborative rehearsal, on the other hand, has been found to be more effective. And basically, that means elaborative rehearsal means focusing on the meaning of the information to help you encode it and transfer it into your long-term memory. And definitely relates the information to other information that you already know. Okay, so as you're listening to this, I just want to make you aware of one of the things that I do when I am teaching and explaining new information to you. And if you notice, I don't just give the definition, I actually elaborate upon it. I say something like, well, so this is how it relates to you. This is how people do this in everyday life, that kind of thing. Well, I'm actually elaborating upon it to help you get this into your long-term memory. Okay, and then there's what's known, another thing to help memory is what's known as retrieval cues. So really quick here, a retrieval cue down below here is actually the definition for it. That's a clue, prompt, or a hint that can help trigger recall of a stored memory. So a retrieval cue can be anything. That can be like, remember earlier in the very beginning of this video, I said photographs can help one to recall their memories. Well, that photograph is a retrieval cue. Now, retrieval, just as a reminder, remember that just means pulling the information from your memory and becoming aware of it. So basically, what we generally tend to say in everyday life, we just call that remembering. But actually, it's retrieving the information from our long-term memory. And then last but not least here, forgetting. Well, we all know what forgetting is, because forgetting means we're just not able to remember. We are not able to retrieve the information that we thought we, had actually stored in our long-term memory. Let's go take that a little further here. So here's an example of maybe a little bit of a failure to actually recall or retrieve information. This is known as the tip of the tongue experience. So I'm sure you all have said that at one point or another. You said, oh, it's right on the tip of my tongue. I feel like I've got it, almost ready to remember, but I just cannot pull it up here. Well, that is the tip of the tongue experience. So just keep in mind, usually you'll, about 90% of tip of tongue experiences, they're eventually resolved. People will remember within a few minutes what they were trying to say. Okay, so another device or a factor that can actually aid in memory development, storing memory or recalling memory, is what's known as a mnemonic device. So a mnemonic device basically is it's a memory device. It's any kind of technique that aids one in remembering or retrieving information from their memory. So take, for instance, this photograph right here. This is just a way to help those who would like to know how many days are in each month. Some months have 31 days, some have 30, and then one of them only has 28. Well, here was just a little way, a mnemonic device to help individuals remember how many days are in each month. So if you're interested in this, and actually learning this technique, pause the video. Take a look at it. All right, let's move forward here. Okay, so then we're going to take a look at what's called the serial position effect. Okay, so this we're kind of looking at, basically kind of, how we remember, in what kinds of processes, how do we actually remember what things, how can I put this? We remember according to the position, the order in which we remember things. Okay, so that's referred to as a serial position effect. Tendency to remember items at the beginning and the end of a list better than items in the middle. Okay, so for those of you who have ever been to, a live music concert, take for instance, one will usually remember the first song of the concert and often the last song of the concert. Okay, and then the middle part of the concert might be a little harder to remember. Okay, so remembering something that occurs at the beginning of the list or the event That is what's known as the primacy effect. Now, the tendency to recall the last item in a list or the final items in a list, that is actually known as recency effect. All right, some other things that kind of give us some insight into factors that help us to remember. So there's what's known as the encoding specificity principle. And all that really means, in simpler terms, basically, when the conditions of retrieval are similar to conditions of encoding. So if that is true, then retrieval is more likely to be successful. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, like take for instance, if one studies, has a routine, and one studies exactly, at the same time, roughly each day, same part of the day, and at the same location, like a specific desk in a specific room or something. And, well, then when one is in that same type of scenario or condition, then one may actually find it easier to retrieve information that one actually encoded and stored while in that specific room or within that condition or scenario. Now down below here, so we call that context effect, by the way. So within that specific context, all right, that's what we're referring to, the context of sitting, a certain type of day, certain day of the week, and then a certain room and certain desk, et cetera, et cetera. It's a specific context we're referring to. Now, on the other hand, though, we may be referring to if one is experiencing similar emotions to when the information was gone over and memorized and stuff. So if the emotion is similar, that's actually called mood congruence. So a good example of that, will be if one was very happy and when one was learning this information was in a very good mood. And then later on, when one is in a similar mood, you might be able to actually retrieve that information a lot more efficiently than if one was in the opposite mood, like a bad mood or extremely tired or something like that. So earlier we also talked about, when we looked at the photograph of, take for instance the 9/11 terrorist attack, and I said, a lot of people will look at that and say, oh yeah, I will never forget where I was that day or something like that. Well, that type of memory is what's known as the flashbulb memory. And I had a couple, some questions right here, like maybe, maybe examples of flashbulb memories, that kind of thing. Let's move forward here. Okay, so we're going to take a look now. We're going to move our attention actually into forgetting. So we may have, stored the information and it's, in there, but we're having a hard time retrieving it, and we are, quote unquote, forgetting the information. So this researcher, Ebbinghaus, actually coined the term the forgetting curve in his research. He found that much of what is forgotten is actually lost relatively soon after we originally learned it. So why is that important to you? Okay, well, I will explain that here on the next slide. Okay, so just hold on, keep that in your mind. And another thing Ebbinghaus also said is, how quickly we actually forget the material that we learn. That depends on how well the material was encoded in the first place, how meaningful the material was, and how often it was rehearsed. Okay, so right there, I'm going to pause here and we're going to actually take a look. I would like to talk about that just a little more in depth. So when you are studying and you want to memorize information, take for instance, at the very least, you want to do really well on an exam or something, or the information is actually very important to you and you enjoy very much, and you may be actually using this in your future career or something. Well, definitely things like making sure that the material was encoded, and rehearsing it often. That means repetition, right? And though you'll know that from my classes and everything, I do repeat myself very often, and that is why I'm actually trying to help students get the data or information into their long-term memory and not forget it right away. So taking discussion a little bit further, we were talking about Ebbinghaus and what he calls the forgetting curve. And this is an actual chart of what Ebbinghaus actually discovered. And right here on the left-hand side of this graph right here, all right, this is actually refers to percentage of the information that is actually retained in one's memory. Okay. And then right here, this is number of days right here down below here. Okay, this actually refers to numbers of days, the interval between when one originally learned the material and then when one is trying to actually test their memory, that they actually can still remember it. Okay, so Ebbinghaus found, as you can see right here, immediately when one learns something, when one is first hearing it, one might be able to have 100% retention, but then it immediately drops very rapidly, all the way down to, roughly 40 to, or so percent. So actually 60% of what one learns, if not practiced, and repetitiously practice and then eventually stored into long-term memory, roughly 60% of the information is actually forgotten very rapidly. So one can see here that even 2 days later, that actually goes down to where only 30% of the information is actually retained. And then it gradually decreases as the days progress, all right? So very little memory loss of the information over the course of the following several weeks. So basically, what is important to know from this diagram right here is just know that the great majority of the material that one learns is actually forgotten very quickly unless it is actually studied and reviewed and practiced for a while. And if one doesn't, then actually it will progressively decline. So why do we forget though? So we haven't taken a look at why we actually forget. We've taken a look at, forgetting, some definition and how we forget, and everything, but we haven't discussed why we forget. And so one of the reasons why we actually forget, scientists have determined that when information is not encoded initially into the long-term memory, so that is known as encoding failure, okay? So failure to encode the information into one's long-term memory, that's why we may actually forget and have a hard time retrieving it in the future. So we have to be very careful and methodical about encoding information efficiently into our long-term memory. So I just want to make you aware of a certain term here, and the actual concept you're very well aware of, and I'm sure a lot of you, this happens to you fairly often. Okay, so there's this term down below here known as prospective memory error. And that basically just means forgetting what you need to do in the future. So take, for instance, say you at night, before you're going to sleep or something, you say, oh, that's right, I'm supposed to do this tomorrow. But you don't write it down, or you don't have something to help you remember that. Well, actually forgetting, what needs to be done in the future on the next day or something, that is prospective memory error. Another reason we will forget often is what's known as decay theory. Okay, so basically, I just want to make you aware of the fact that whenever we form a new memory in our brain, there's actually a chemical change in our brain. Okay, so definitely because there's a chemical, physiological, neurobiological type function going on, or so I'll just leave it at that. But let me carry on here before I get distracted. So definitely what happens is those structural or chemical changes that actually occur in the brain when a new memory is formed, well, those can actually kind of fade away, get weaker, because remember, it's physiological. That means that, that it's not going to stay in that perfect shape or whatever forever unless it's actually used. So that is known as decay theory. So the actual structural or chemical changes in the brain, they actually decay over a period of time if they're not used on a regular basis. So that is another reason why we tend to forget. Okay. Now here are a couple other things that make it can interfere with our memory. It's what's known as interference theory. So basically, all that means is when memories actually interfere with other memories. Okay, so let's take a look at that here. Okay, so there are two types of interference down below here, and I put them in red. The first is what's called retroactive interference. That means a new memory interferes with remembering old information. So if you've ever experienced that, like right when you first hear something or learn something, and then all of a sudden you try to compare that or hook that to something is similar, but you go, oh, now I can't remember that. Now that, you said this to me or whatever, that totally interfered with my memory of something. Well, that's retroactive interference. Now, on the other hand, there's what's known as proactive interference, and that means an old memory interferes with remembering new information. Now, there's also what is known as motivated forgetting, and that basically just means one is motivated to not remember, to actually forget undesired memories. So there are two types. There's what's known as suppression. That just means consciously forgetting. Okay, so consciously forgetting, suppressing memories. Like take, for instance, if something really terrible happens to an individual, something in life that is just some event that was just too terrible, and they say, that's it. I'm never thinking about that again. I want to get that out of my mind. Well, that is what's known as suppression. On the other hand, repression is an unconscious forgetting. So, that might be for other reasons, definitely unconscious. So suppression is conscious. Repression is unconscious. Okay, now talking about memory and everything, we, may actually have experienced or thought about the idea that, well, our memory is definitely, it can change over time, things like that. Well, we're going to talk about that very briefly here, so definitely memory details can change over time. So details can be added, subtracted, exaggerated, or downplayed. Okay, so let's stop there for just a second and just think about the idea that, like, take for instance in court when there is eyewitness testimony and an individual is called to be an eyewitness to something that happened, maybe a long time ago or something. Well, and they say, oh, yes, I remember very explicitly what happened and everything, but they might not be aware of the fact that their memory details actually changed. Maybe, things were added to it or subtracted or exaggerated, downplayed, so there's one example of how memory details can change over time and how this occurs in real life right here. Now, there's also what is known as the misinformation effect. Okay, and so that is another way of referring to what I was talking about the eyewitness type of effect. So recollection of an original event can be distorted. So basically what I said earlier. And then source confusion. That refers to basically remembering where an exact memory actually came from. So I don't know if you've experienced it or ever seen somebody experience this, but they'll say, oh yeah, I learned this information. I learned this from, this source. And then someone will say, actually, no, you didn't. You actually learned this from so-and-so told you this. So you didn't learn this on the internet or something. This was something that somebody told you. So that was actually an example of source confusion. Okay, so that's just, I put this on this slide just to kind of give you a moment to sort of review that, just kind of think about that. And this just refers to here, I just put this little diagram right here. It just kind of shows you how one's memory can actually change over a period of time. So, definitely review this on your own time here. But I put this in here just to kind of give you a little extra option here to study this. Okay, another form of basically one could say forgetting, not remembering, is what's known as amnesia. And amnesia actually means severe memory loss. So there are two types of amnesia, and I put those in red here. The first is what's known as retrograde amnesia, and basically that just means the inability to remember past episodic information. So, remembering stuff from one's past. And so, definitely things like head injuries and things can be responsible for that, as well as other types of issues. Okay, and then the second type of amnesia is what's referred to as anterograde amnesia. And basically that means inability to form new memories. And that's usually related to a part in the brain called the hippocampus. And I think you'll remember that from our study about neuroscience. Okay, so let's take that a little bit further here. So here's another example. This is just an example of maybe a real life event. And this is how actually wording of an event can alter one's memory of the event. So take, for instance, in this left-hand side picture right here, we see an accident with two cars, right? And then so when people, when witnesses, they were asked questions about the event, their memory of the event were altered by leading questions. So what I mean by leading questions, like take for instance, if they were asked, well, did you notice when these, which vehicle smashed the other? So, so here was basically, using the term smashed. Well, then maybe the eyewitness actually kind of thought, well, because you used the term smashed, that must have meant they were actually traveling at a higher rate of speed. And that's what this is right here. And then here are some examples of other terms used, like collided, bumped, hit, contacted. And those terms, those terminology actually can affect how one perceives information and then actually remembers it later on. So definitely leading questions can definitely affect one's memory. Another way that one can have experience issues with getting, making sure that memories stick into one's, consciousness or brain or mind. Definitely things like head injuries, like in sports, and those can actually develop consolidation, problems and actually lose memories permanently. And this discussion would not be complete without just taking a look at a diagram of the actual brain and discussing maybe some of the neuroscience involved with memory. So first of all, on the left-hand side here, we have with the prefrontal cortex, which I'm sure you're aware of at this point in the course. But that's what's kind of involved in memorizing sequence of events, but not the events themselves. Okay. Now, other parts of the brain, though, like hippocampus, okay, right in here, that actually encodes and transfers new explicit memory to the long-term memory. So remember, that means conscious memory, the hippocampus. So definitely it's your hippocampus that is engaged as you are storing this incoming new information from this video into your long-term memory. That is actually your hippocampus that is helping facilitate that process. Okay, right to the left of the hippocampus is what's known as the amygdala, and that actually encodes the emotional aspects of memory. And the amygdala also, taking that a little further, really encodes negative and fearful type memories and actually communicates with the prefrontal cortex, and that's what actually facilitates an emotional response to an event or something. Like take for instance, if one is an eyewitness to like that car accident that we just discussed in a previous video. Okay, and right here on the lower right-hand side, there's this part of the brain, this structure right here, what's known as the cerebellum, and basically that is responsible for movement, memories, about movement. And so that is, more of the implicit type memory, right? So definitely things like muscle memory, sports, just things like that. That is the cerebellum that is involved in that process. And similar to the hippocampus, remember I said that encodes and transfers explicit memories into the long-term memory. So does the medial temporal lobe right here. And you can't really see it, it's kind of underneath right here. But those are the main parts of the brain that are involved in memory formation, encoding, and storing. So that actually concludes our discussion about memory. I hope that was insightful and gave you a lot to think about. I highly recommend you review this. Give yourself a little break from it. Try to review this maybe in a day or so and start getting some of this into your long-term memory.